Have you ever woken up drenched in sweat, your heart pounding, unsure if you just escaped a nightmare or if the nightmare has followed you into the waking world? My name is Asher Vane, and I've spent years exploring the forgotten corners of our world, abandoned buildings, silent ruins, places no one dares to visit. But nothing prepared me for the chilling events I'm about to share. It started with a dream, one so vivid that it felt more like a memory, one that refused to let me wake peacefully. In this dream, I found myself in a place that seemed oddly familiar yet utterly foreign, a decrepit school, cloaked in shadows that seemed to shift and breathe. The school was alive, but not with the sounds of life as we know it. There were whispers, faint but insistent, threading through the air like a sinister melody. Laughter echoed faintly, not the joyous laughter of children, but something warped, distorted, as if it were mocking me. The walls bled with peeling paint, revealing strange symbols carved beneath, symbols that pulsed faintly, as if they held secrets too dark to speak aloud. And yet, something about that place called to me, as though it had been waiting for me, as though it knew I would come. Before I take you deeper into this nightmare, I need to ask, are you sure you're ready? Here at Nightmare Chronicles, every story we tell is a journey into the unknown, into the places where light dares not go. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because you'll want to stay with me as we uncover the truth behind this haunting tale. Turn on notifications to make sure you don't miss a single chilling story. And remember, some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. This isn't just a story, it's a warning. As I tell you about the dream and the horrifying events that followed, keep an eye on your surroundings. Strange things have a way of happening when you listen to stories like these. That school wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It felt like a message, a summons from something that exists on the edge of our understanding. So, brace yourself. What I'm about to tell you isn't for the faint of heart. Are you ready to face the darkness with me? Let's begin. It started on a quiet night, the kind where the silence outside seems too deep, too still, as if the world itself were holding its breath. I drifted into sleep, expecting nothing but the usual swirl of dreams that fade with the morning light. But this dream was different. It pulled me in, sharp and vivid, with a clarity that made my pulse quicken. Suddenly, I was standing before an enormous, crumbling building, a school. Its windows were dark, shattered like vacant eyes staring back at me. The air was thick, oppressive, carrying a faint metallic tang that made me hesitate to breathe too deeply. As I stepped closer, the rusted gates creaked open on their own, their sound slicing through the eerie silence. The school's facade was covered in graffiti and blackened scorch marks, as if fire and chaos had tried to erase its existence. But it still stood, defiant and waiting. Against my better judgment, I entered. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air shifted. A chilling breeze swept through the hallway, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of mildew and burnt wood. Beneath that was something else, something faint but sickeningly sweet, like decaying flowers left too long in stagnant water. It was the smell of something long dead but not forgotten. The interior was a maze of empty classrooms, their desks overturned and covered in a thin layer of dust. But what struck me most was the sound. It started faint, almost imperceptible laughter. Childlike, high-pitched, but warped, like a record played too slowly. It echoed from down the hall, each note sending shivers down my spine. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a trick of my imagination. Yet, with every step I took, the laughter grew louder, sharper, filling the air until it seemed to vibrate in my bones. As I moved deeper into the building, the floor beneath me groaned, the wood soft and rotting under my weight. My shoes stuck slightly with every step, as though the floor itself didn't want to let me go. On the walls, strange markings began to appear, symbols scratched into the paint, pulsating faintly as if they were alive. One of the symbols caught my eye. It felt familiar, as though I'd seen it before, but I couldn't place where. My stomach churned with a mix of fear and nausea, the sense of déjà vu wrapping around me like a noose. I turned a corner and found myself in a long hallway. The walls here were lined with lockers, their doors ajar, revealing nothing but emptiness within. Yet, as I walked past, one locker door creaked open wider, revealing a single notebook sitting inside. Against all logic, I reached for it. The moment my fingers brushed the worn leather cover, a deafening slam echoed behind me. The sound was so sudden, so violent, that I dropped the notebook and spun around. There was nothing there, only the faint sound of that warped laughter again, now coming from the direction I had just come. I picked up the notebook, my hands trembling. As I flipped it open, the pages were blank, except for one at the very center. Scrawled in jagged, childlike handwriting were the words, "We're still here." My heart raced, the words burning themselves into my mind. The lights in the hallway flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a shadow dart across the far end. It was too fast, too unnatural to belong to anything human. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to obey. It was as if the school itself wanted me to stay, to see what lay beyond. Then, from the darkness at the end of the hallway, a soft voice whispered my name. "Asher!" The sound sent a cold wave down my spine, freezing me in place. It wasn't a question. It was a summons. And against all reason, I felt myself compelled to follow it. This was no ordinary dream. It felt like I had stepped into a place that existed on the border of reality, a space where the living and the dead converged. Whatever waited for me deeper inside that school wasn't just watching, it was calling me. The further I ventured into the school, the more the air seemed to thicken, clinging to my skin like a damp, suffocating shroud. The warped laughter from earlier had faded, replaced by a heavy, almost deafening silence. But this silence wasn't comforting. It felt alive, as though something unseen was observing my every move, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, twisting and writhing in ways that defied the dim, flickering light sources. Each step I took felt heavier, as if the building itself were trying to pull me deeper into its labyrinthine embrace. I reached a stairwell that descended into darkness, its metal railing rusted and cold to the touch. As I hesitated at the top, a faint sound reached my ears, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like the footsteps of a child running in circles below. My heart quickened, and every rational part of my mind screamed at me to turn back, to wake up. But something stronger, a mix of morbid curiosity and an inexplicable pull, forced me to continue. The stairs groaned under my weight, each creak echoing like a warning as I descended. At the bottom, I found myself in what appeared to be the basement. The walls were lined with old pipes, some leaking water that pooled into murky puddles on the floor. The air here was colder, carrying an unbearable stench of rot and decay. A faint glow emanated from a room at the end of the corridor, the light pulsating as though it were alive. As I moved closer, I could hear faint whispers, unintelligible yet oddly familiar, like fragments of a long-forgotten memory. The sound wrapped around me, burrowing into my mind, making it hard to think clearly. When I reached the room, the door was slightly ajar, creaking ominously as I pushed it open. Inside, the glow came from an old projector, its beam casting flickering images onto a crumbling wall. The film seemed ancient, its frame scratched and distorted, showing scenes of children sitting in a classroom. Their faces, however, were wrong, blurred and featureless, like smudged charcoal drawings. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a dissonant hum that made my head throb. The air in the room felt charged, almost electric, and I realized I wasn't alone. In the corner of the room, something moved, a shadow, darker than the surrounding blackness, shifting unnaturally. It seemed to grow taller, its shape becoming more defined as it stepped closer to the light. My breath caught in my throat as I saw it. A figure cloaked in shadow, its face obscured except for two glowing, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce straight into my soul. It didn't move like a person. It glided, its presence exuding a cold malice that made my knees buckle. Before I could react, the projector flickered violently, and the light in the room died. I was plunged into total darkness. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed against my ears like a physical force. My instincts took over, and I fumbled for the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the room itself was holding me captive. Then a sharp, raspy voice whispered directly into my ear, "You shouldn't be here." Panic surged through me, and I pounded on the door, desperate to escape. Suddenly, the projector sputtered back to life, illuminating the room once more. The figure was gone, but the shadow it cast lingered on the wall, moving unnaturally as if taunting me. The whispers returned, louder this time, and the images on the wall changed. Now they showed scenes of me, walking through the school, descending the stairs, and finally entering this very room. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't just dreaming. Something was watching me, recording my every move. The light from the projector dimmed, and the shadow on the wall began to peel itself away, taking on a life of its own. I backed away, my legs trembling, until I felt the cold wall behind me. The shadow loomed closer, its shape shifting into something grotesque, something inhuman. My vision blurred, my chest tightening, as if the very air was being stolen from my lungs. Just as I was about to collapse, the projector flickered again, and everything vanished. The shadow, the whispers, the unnatural glow. I was alone in the room, but the feeling of being watched remained. Clutching the wall for support, I stumbled out of the basement, my mind racing. The school wasn't just abandoned, it was alive, feeding on fear, pulling me deeper into its grip. Whatever was down there, it wasn't finished with me. And I wasn't sure if I had the strength to face what lay ahead. The hallway I stumbled into was unlike the others. The walls were charred black, as if they had been scorched by an unrelenting fire, and yet, they pulsed faintly as though the destruction had left behind something alive. The air was suffocating, heavy with the acrid smell of smoke and something far worse, decay, ancient and sickening. Every step echoed unnaturally, the sound rippling through the corridor and fading into an ominous silence. Ahead, a door stood ajar, and from it, an otherworldly glow spilled out, casting eerie, dancing shadows on the walls. My heart thundered as I approached the door, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But something deeper, something almost primal, urged me forward. As I pushed the door open, the glow enveloped me, bathing the room in an unsettling crimson light. In the center of the room was a decrepit teacher's desk, and on it lay a single, cracked bell. Its surface was rusted and etched with strange symbols, similar to the ones I had seen carved into the walls earlier. The sight of it made my stomach churn with dread, though I couldn't explain why. The room itself was hauntingly preserved, as if frozen in time. Desks sat in neat rows, untouched by the decay that consumed the rest of the school. Each desk bore a name scratched into its surface, some carved with such ferocity that the wood splintered. The windows, however, were wrong. They reflected not the crimson light of the room, but endless darkness, like portals to another dimension. And in the reflections I saw movement. Shapes twisted and writhed, though when I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. As I stepped further inside, the bell on the desk let out a faint chime, though no one had touched it. The sound was piercing, sharp, cutting through the oppressive silence like a blade. In an instant, the atmosphere shifted. The crimson light flickered violently, and the desks began to creak as if something unseen was moving among them. Then came the whispers, dozens, no, hundreds of overlapping voices, chanting something incomprehensible. Their tone wasn't angry, but pleading, desperate, as though they were begging for release. Suddenly, the shadows in the windows began to take form. One by one, they stepped out, their movements jerky and unnatural, like puppets controlled by invisible strings. Their faces were blank, featureless, yet their heads turned toward me in unison, as if they could see me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as they began to move closer, their movements erratic but purposeful. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body felt paralyzed, pinned by their invisible gaze. One of the figures stopped inches from me. Though it had no eyes, I felt its stare bore into my soul. Slowly, it raised a hand and pointed toward the bell on the desk. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if urging me to do something. My trembling hand reached for the bell, though I didn't understand why. The moment my fingers grazed its cold, rusted surface, a deafening scream filled the room. Not from me, but from the shadows. They writhed and twisted violently, their forms dissolving into smoke that spiraled toward the ceiling and vanished. The crimson light dimmed, and for a moment, the room was silent. But then, from the darkness behind me, came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. My body tensed as I turned, and there it was. The figure from the projector room, its hollow eyes glowing with a malevolent light. It stood still, watching me, its presence exuding a cold that made the air feel like ice. Before I could react, it spoke, its voice a guttural whisper that echoed in my mind. "You've seen too much." The room began to collapse around me, the walls folding in on themselves as the crimson light flared blindingly bright. I felt a force pull me backward, as though the school itself was rejecting me, expelling me from its grasp. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the figure standing motionless in the chaos, its glowing eyes fixed on me. Then, I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as if I had just run for my life. But something was wrong. My hand still felt cold, and when I looked down, I saw a faint, rust-colored mark on my palm, shaped like the bell. This wasn't just a dream. The school had reached out to me, and I feared it wasn't finished. The morning after the dream, the world felt wrong. The sunlight streaming through my window seemed dull, muted, as if the brightness had been leached out of it. My body ached like I had spent the entire night running, and the strange mark on my palm, a faint, rust-colored outline of the bell from the dream, refused to fade, no matter how hard I scrubbed. My mind was a storm of questions, But the more I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, the more I realized that the details were too vivid, too precise to dismiss. It wasn't a dream, it was a warning. Unable to shake the feeling, I began searching online for anything that resembled the school I had seen. At first, there was nothing. But then, after hours of digging, I stumbled upon an article buried in a local history forum. The headline sent a shiver down my spine: "The Abandoned Franklin School, a place of tragedy and unanswered questions." The accompanying photo was unmistakable. It was the same decrepit building from my dream, right down to the scorched walls and rusted gates. The article described the school as the site of a tragic fire over 50 years ago. According to the report, the fire broke out during a winter storm, trapping students and teachers inside. Some claimed the fire spread too quickly, as though it had been fueled by something unnatural. Many of the victims were never recovered, their remains lost in the rubble. The article went on to describe a chilling legend. Locals reported hearing laughter and whispers near the ruins at night, and some swore they had seen ghostly figures moving through the windows. It was said that the spirits of the children never left, forever tethered to the place of their demise. My heart raced as I read the accounts. Every detail from the article mirrored what I had seen in the dream. The laughter, the shadows, even the strange symbols on the walls. I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that this was more than a coincidence. The dream wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was connected to something real, something dark that refused to stay buried. Desperate for answers, I dug deeper, searching for anything that could explain why I was being drawn to this place. That's when I found another unsettling detail. Several people who had visited the school reported strange occurrences afterward. One man claimed he woke up to find soot marks on his walls spelling out his name. Another spoke of seeing shadowy figures lingering at the edge of his vision, always watching but never approaching. All of them described an overwhelming sense of being marked, as though the school had chosen them. The more I read, the more the lines between my dream and reality blurred. I discovered an old photo of the school's interior taken before the fire, and my blood ran cold. In the photo, the teacher's desk had a small, cracked bell sitting atop it, the same bell I had touched in the dream. Beneath the photo was a caption that chilled me to my core. The bell was used to call students to their lessons, but legend says it still rings when someone disturbs the spirits of the school. I couldn't stop myself. I needed to know more. I posted on the forum, asking if anyone had recent experiences with the school. A few hours later, I received a direct message from someone named E. The message was short and cryptic. "You've seen it, haven't you? The school doesn't let go. Meet me tomorrow. I'll explain everything." Attached was an address, one that wasn't far from my own. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards in my house, every gust of wind outside, felt like a sinister reminder of the school. I kept hearing faint laughter, soft and distant, but no matter how hard I tried to pinpoint its source, it always seemed to fade into the shadows. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were plagued by images of the school, the shadows, and the bell. But there was one new element, a figure standing in the corner of every scene, its hollow eyes glowing faintly, always watching. When I woke, I found a fresh soot mark on the wall beside my bed. This time it wasn't a symbol, it was the outline of a door, perfectly matching the one I had entered in the dream. The school was reaching for me, and I knew I couldn't escape its grasp. The next day, the address led me to a small, weathered house on the edge of town. The windows were boarded up, and the overgrown lawn gave the place an air of abandonment. Yet, as I approached, I noticed a faint light flickering inside, as if someone, or something, was waiting for me. My stomach churned with unease, but I couldn't turn back. Whoever E was, they seemed to know about the school, and I needed answers. The door creaked open before I could knock, revealing a man who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. His eyes were sunken, his skin pale, and his hands trembled as he gestured for me to enter. "You saw it, didn't you?" he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, and his expression darkened. "Once it finds you, it doesn't let go. You have to understand, it's not just a place. It's a hunger." Inside, the air was thick with the smell of burnt wood and something metallic. The walls were covered in newspaper clippings and faded photographs, all connected to the Franklin School. Some showed the building in its prime, others depicted the aftermath of the fire, charred desks, broken windows, and haunting shadows in the smoke. But what caught my attention were the symbols. They were everywhere, scrawled in ink, charcoal, even blood. They matched the markings I had seen in the school and in my dream. Elias, he finally introduced himself, began to recount his own experience. Years ago, he had been dared to enter the school as a teenager. He laughed nervously as he described how harmless it had seemed at first, just another spooky old building. But then the whispers started, and the laughter followed. "It's like it knows your fears," he said, his voice shaking. "It shows you things you can't unsee." He pointed to a stack of notebooks on the table, each one filled with detailed accounts of people who had visited the school and were never the same afterward. "You're not the first," Elias said grimly, "and you won't be the last. It marks people. The dream was just its way of pulling you in. Now it wants you to come back." I tried to protest, to tell him it was just a nightmare, but he cut me off. "Look at your hand," he said. Reluctantly, I uncurled my fingers. The mark of the bell was darker now, almost as if it had burned itself into my skin. "That's its claim," Elias explained. "You touched something you shouldn't have. It knows you now." Despite his warnings, I couldn't ignore the pull I felt toward the school. It wasn't just fear. It was curiosity, an irresistible need to uncover its secrets. Elias sighed heavily, as if he had seen this before. "If you're going back, you need to be ready," he said. "But know this, the school doesn't just show you horrors. It makes you a part of them." That night, I drove to the school. The building loomed in the darkness, its silhouette jagged and imposing against the faint glow of the moon. The gate was open, swaying slightly in the wind, as if it were inviting me in. My breath fogged in the cold night air as I stepped inside. The silence was immediate and deafening, pressing against my ears like a physical force. This time, the atmosphere was different. The air felt heavier, almost liquid, and every step I took echoed unnaturally, as though the school itself was amplifying the sound. The whispers returned, faint at first but growing louder with each passing moment. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, overlapping in a cacophony that made my skin crawl. As I moved through the hallways, I noticed new details. The symbols on the walls were no longer static. They shifted and writhed as if alive, their lines twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to watch me. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, always just out of reach. I turned a corner and stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the middle of the hallway, stood a figure. It was a child, or at least it resembled one. Its face was obscured, its features blurred as though smudged by an unseen hand. It held something in its hands, a small, cracked bell. The sound of it ringing was faint but relentless, each chime reverberating in my chest like a warning. The figure tilted its head, as if studying me, then pointed toward the basement stairwell. I hesitated, every fiber of my being screaming at me to leave. But something stronger, the same pull that had brought me here, urged me forward. The figure disappeared as I approached, its form dissolving into smoke. The stairwell stretched before me, the steps plunging into a darkness so absolute it felt alive. My hand brushed the cold metal railing as I descended, each step echoing louder than the last. At the bottom, the whispers stopped. The silence was suffocating, thicker than before, and the air reeked of burnt flesh and decay. A single door stood at the end of the hallway, its surface covered in claw marks and the same pulsing symbols. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling, and pushed it open. What I found inside would shatter any doubt I had left about the school's nature. It wasn't just haunted, it was something far worse. It was waiting, and it was hungry. The door creaked open with an agonizing slowness, revealing a room that seemed to exist outside of time and space. It was larger than the school itself, impossibly vast, with walls that seemed to stretch into a void of shifting darkness. The air was frigid, colder than anything I'd ever felt, and it carried the faint, acrid scent of burnt paper and decaying wood. At the center of the room, illuminated by a dim, pulsing light, was a desk. On it lay the bell, the same cracked and rusted object from my dream. But this time it was different. It seemed to vibrate faintly, as if alive. Surrounding the desk were rows of broken chairs, each one occupied by shadowy figures. They were children, or at least remnants of them, their forms flickering like static on an old television. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, fixed on me as I stepped inside. None of them moved, but their presence was overwhelming. My breath caught in my throat as a low hum filled the room, growing louder with each hesitant step I took. It wasn't just sound, it was a vibration that resonated in my bones, a wordless chant that seemed to speak directly to my fear. The whispers began again, but this time they were clear, distinct. They weren't coming from the shadows, they were coming from the bell. "Ring it," they urged, their voices overlapping in an eerie harmony. "Set us free." My hands trembled as I moved closer to the desk, my gaze locked on the bell. The symbols etched into its surface seemed to writhe under the faint light, forming shapes that felt agonizingly familiar. It was as if the bell was showing me pieces of a memory I had long buried. Before I could touch it, the air in the room shifted. The shadows of the children began to stir, their forms twisting and contorting as if something was pulling them apart. A figure emerged from the darkness behind the desk. It was the same entity from my dream, its hollow eyes burning brighter now, filled with an ancient, malevolent intelligence. Its form was indistinct, a swirling mass of shadows and jagged edges that seemed to absorb the light around it. It towered over the desk, its presence oppressive and suffocating. "You shouldn't have come back," it said, its voice a guttural, layered echo that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The vibrations in the air grew stronger, and I felt my knees weaken under the weight of its gaze. "You've seen too much, and now you belong to us." Desperation surged through me, and I forced myself to speak, though my voice came out as a trembling whisper. "What do you want from me?" The entity leaned closer, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. "It's not about what we want. It's about what you owe." The room began to shift, the walls warping and dissolving into a swirling void of shadows. The whispers grew deafening, forming words I couldn't understand but felt in my very soul. The figures of the children were no longer flickering. They had become solid, their faces twisted with anguish and rage. They began to rise from their seats, their movements jerky and unnatural, as though they were puppets being controlled by invisible strings. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as the entity extended a clawed hand toward the bell. "Ring it," it commanded, its voice sharp and final. "Seal your fate, or theirs." The choice was clear, but it was impossible. If I rang the bell, I feared I would unleash something far worse than the shadows that haunted this place. But if I refused, the children's hollow eyes promised no mercy. As the entity loomed closer, I noticed something on the desk, a journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. It was open to a passage written in frantic, messy handwriting. "The bell binds them. The bell controls them. But the price is eternal." My mind raced as I pieced together the terrible truth. The bell wasn't just a relic, it was the key to this place, a link between the living and the dead. Whoever rang it would become the new keeper, bound to the school and its horrors forever. With no time to think, I made my choice. My hand shot out, not for the bell, but for the journal. The moment my fingers touched it, the room exploded with light, blinding and searing. The entity roared, its voice filled with rage and agony as the shadows recoiled. The children froze, their forms flickering once more before dissolving into the void. The walls of the room began to collapse, folding in on themselves as the entity screamed, "This isn't over." Before I could comprehend what was happening, I felt a force yank me backward, pulling me out of the room and through the endless, twisting corridors of the school. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the bell, still vibrating on the desk, its eerie glow pulsating like a heartbeat. I woke up hours later, outside the school's gates. My body ached, my clothes were torn, and the journal was clutched tightly in my hand. The mark on my palm had grown darker, now a deep, angry red, as though the school had left its final warning. As I staggered to my feet, I heard it, faint but unmistakable, the sound of the bell ringing deep within the ruins. The school wasn't done with me. Not yet. I awoke in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, I thought I had escaped the nightmare, that everything, the school, the bell, the shadows, had been a vivid, horrifying dream. But then I noticed the journal. It was lying on my desk, its brittle pages glowing faintly under the dim light of my lamp. The symbols etched into its cover seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, a silent reminder of the choices I had made and the horrors I had witnessed. My hand still bore the mark of the bell, darker and more defined now, as though burned into my skin. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was nothing more than a lingering hallucination. But as I stared at the mark, I heard it again, the faint, haunting chime of the bell, distant yet distinct. It wasn't coming from the journal or my memory. It was here in my home. I turned slowly, scanning the room. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift unnaturally, stretching and curling as if they were alive. My breath caught as I saw something move in the corner, a dark shape barely distinguishable from the shadows themselves. It was watching me, its hollow eyes faintly glowing in the darkness. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving behind only the faint echo of whispers that seemed to seep into my mind. Over the following days, the disturbances grew worse. The bell's chime became more frequent, its sound reverberating through my house at all hours of the day and night. Objects began to move on their own, small at first, like a chair slightly out of place or a light flickering. But soon it escalated. Doors slammed shut behind me, the walls creaked with an unnatural rhythm, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony that filled my ears until I couldn't think. The journal seemed to act as a conduit, its pages now filled with strange, ever-changing symbols that glowed faintly in the dark. Every time I opened it, I felt a wave of cold dread wash over me, as though something, or someone, was staring back through the ink. I tried to destroy it, but no matter what I did, burning, tearing, throwing it away, it always reappeared on my desk, pristine and waiting. Then came the dreams. Every night, I found myself back in the school, wandering its endless, crumbling corridors. The shadows were always there, lurking just out of reach, their hollow eyes watching my every move. The bell rang constantly, its chime growing louder as I approached the basement door. But I never dared to open it. Each time I woke, the mark on my hand felt hotter, as if it were alive, pulsing in sync with the bell's relentless rhythm. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I returned to the journal, desperate for answers. Among the pages of symbols, a single line of text stood out, written in blood-red ink. You cannot escape what you've chosen. The bell has rung for you. My blood ran cold as the realization sank in. The school hadn't just marked me, it had claimed me. And now, its horrors were bleeding into my reality. I began to notice the symbol of the bell appearing everywhere, on walls, etched into mirrors, even carved into the frost on my windows. It was as if the school was spreading, its influence creeping further into my life. The whispers began to follow me outside, faint at first but growing louder as the days went on. People around me seemed oblivious, their faces blank and distant, as though they couldn't hear the haunting sounds that filled my ears. One evening, as I stared into the journal, the whispers suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing against me like a physical force. Then, the shadows began to gather. They coalesced into a shape, forming the same towering figure I had seen in the school. Its hollow eyes burned brighter than ever, and its voice echoed in my mind, "You belong to us now." Before I could react, the lights in my room flickered and died. The figure stepped closer, its form blotting out the faint glow of the journal. "You rang the bell," it said, its voice a guttural growl. "You opened the door. And now it cannot be closed." When I awoke, I was lying on the floor, the journal clutched tightly in my hands. The mark on my palm had spread, its intricate lines now crawling up my wrist like dark veins. I knew then that this wasn't over. The school's grasp extended beyond its walls, and it was pulling me deeper into its darkness. The question wasn't if I could escape, it was how long I could hold on before it consumed me entirely. As I sit here recounting this story, I know the school is still watching me. The bell's chime continues to echo in my ears, and the shadows grow closer with every passing day. But what haunts me most is this: the mark isn't just mine anymore. It's spreading. If you've watched this far, you're part of it now. Look around you. Do you hear the whispers? Do you see the shadows shifting? Leave your theories in the comments. What is the bell, and why does it choose its victims? And more importantly, why me? If you felt something, anything, while watching this, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Join our community of seekers who aren't afraid to face the unknown. But remember, the bell has rung. And sometimes what it calls for doesn't let go. We'll see you in the next nightmare. If you dare to return,